The snow had no mercy that morning. It pressed itself into the seams of boots, crept through wool, numbed fingers until rifles felt like foreign objects. January 1945 did not announce itself gently in the Belgian countryside. It arrived like a verdict. White fields stretched outward in every direction, broken only by bare trees that looked less like shelter and more like witnesses. Somewhere in that frozen quiet, men were kneeling. American men, helmets off, hands up, breath shaking in the cold. And standing among them was a first sergeant who did not yet know he was standing inside the narrowest corridor of fate he would ever walk. Leonard Funk had crossed oceans to get here. He had already survived Normandy, where the sky itself had seemed hostile. He had marched through hedgerows that swallowed sound and spat back death. He had fought across France, into Holland, through market gardens' shattered optimism, and finally into the Ardennes, where winter became another enemy with a rifle. By the time he reached Holzheim, Belgium, war was no longer an abstraction. It was texture. It was weight. It was the smell of oil and cold steel. It was the sound of men breathing too fast because they knew what came next. 90 German soldiers stepped out of the snow like a closing door, MP40s leveled. Commands barked in a language Funk did not understand, but the meaning was clear enough. Neo, drop your weapons. This was not a skirmish. This was capture. The kind of moment soldiers imagine in flashes and nightmares, but never rehearse for. His men obeyed. You could hear it in the way the metal touched the ground, final and helpless. Funk stood there with them, the weight of command pressing into his spine, harder than any rucksack ever had. A German officer approached him, young, clean-shaven, confident in the arithmetic of numbers. He spoke quickly, sharply, assuming comprehension. Funk heard none of it. The words slid past him, meaningless sounds carried on frozen air. There was a pause where something was expected of him, an answer, perhaps, submission, fear. Leonard Funk laughed. It was not a heroic laugh, not the defiant kind sung about later. It was a reflex, raw and human, born from confusion and exhaustion and the absurdity of standing alive when so many others were already gone. The sound cut through the cold like a crack in glass. The German officer stiffened. In that fractional moment, less than a heartbeat, everything aligned. Funk saw the spacing of the enemy soldiers. He felt the familiar weight of the Thompson submachine gun still slung across his chest. He understood, suddenly and completely, that history was balanced on seconds. What followed did not last long enough to feel real. 45 seconds, less than a minute, a blur of recoil, shouted orders turning into screams, snow erupting as bodies fell, a lightning reload done by muscle memory alone. When it was over, 21 German soldiers were dead, others were fleeing, and American prisoners were no longer prisoners. The field was quiet again, but it was a different quiet now, the kind that comes after thunder.
This is not a story about violence for its own sake. It is a story about decision under impossible pressure, about how training, instinct, fear, and will collapse into a single action when there is no time left for thought. It is about a man who did not set out to be a legend, and a war that did not care whether he lived or died. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe memory is a responsibility, then stay with this one. Subscribe, not as a gesture, but as a commitment to remembering. Like the video, not for the algorithm, but for the men whose names never made it into headlines. Because Leonard Funk's story did not begin in that snow, and it did not end there either. Leonard Funk did not grow up imagining snow-covered fields in Belgium or the metallic taste of fear pressing against the back of his tongue. He grew up in America, where the horizon felt stable and the future seemed negotiable. The kind of place where work defined a man more than war ever had, where hands were meant for tools, not triggers, where danger was theoretical, something that happened elsewhere, to other people, in other decades. His early life was shaped not by chaos, but by routine, by mornings that followed nights without interruption, by the quiet dignity of responsibility learned slowly rather than forced suddenly. That calm did not make him soft, it made him deliberate. Funk belonged to a generation that learned endurance before it learned ambition. He understood effort. He understood patience. When the world began to tilt toward war, it did not arrive as spectacle. It arrived as inevitability. Newsprint headlines, radio voices stiff with urgency, names of distant places repeated until they no longer felt distant. Pearl Harbor did not just change American policy, it altered the texture of ordinary days. Conversations shortened, silences grew heavier. Men began to look at themselves differently, as if measuring their own reflection against something larger and more demanding. When Funk entered the army, he did not do so chasing glory. He stepped forward because the ground beneath him had shifted, and standing still no longer felt honest. Training stripped away comfort with mechanical precision. Civilians became soldiers through repetition, exhaustion, and discipline enforced until it no longer felt enforced at all. Marching replaced wandering, orders replaced choice, identity narrowed and hardened. You learned quickly that the army did not care who you had been, it cared only about who you could become under pressure. Funk adapted, not loudly, not theatrically. He learned weapons as extensions of the body, not objects to be admired. The Thompson submachine gun was not romantic to him. It was weight, recoil, reliability. He learned to clean it in the dark, fingers moving without sight, because sight was a luxury often denied. He learned to read terrain the way others read faces, noticing where the land tightened and where it opened, where sound carried and where it died. These were not heroic lessons, they were survival math, learned one drill at a time. Leadership found him before he went looking for it. Men watched him because he did not waste words, because when things went wrong, and they always did, he adjusted. Authority in war does not announce itself. It accumulates quietly through competence and the absence of panic. By the time Funk wore the rank of first sergeant, it was not because he demanded respect, but because others deferred without being asked. Then came Europe, England first, a holding pattern of tension where invasion was rehearsed endlessly but never executed. Fields and hedgerows mocked them with their calm. Soldiers filled the time with maintenance, card games, and speculation. Some spoke of what they would do when it was over. Others stopped speaking of the future entirely. Funk paid attention. He noticed who slept too much and who slept too little, who joked too hard, who stared too long to nothing. War had not yet begun for them, but it was already rearranging their interior landscapes. Normandy was not a destination so much as an eruption. When the ramp dropped and the noise hit, it shattered any lingering illusion of control. The air was violent, the ground was contested. Men landed where they were not supposed to land, fought with who they could find, and died without understanding why the plan had abandoned them. Funk survived not because he was invincible, but because he moved. He regrouped fragments into function. He made decisions without certainty and accepted their consequences immediately. This was where the army's abstractions became personal. The days after blurred into each other. Sleep came in pieces. Food lost its taste. Death became frequent enough to feel routine, but never familiar enough to feel acceptable. Funk learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear monopolize action. He watched men break in ways training could not prevent. He watched others rise in ways training could not predict. He carried names with him, silently, like weights that never shifted. As the campaign pressed forward, rank insulated him less than it burdened him. Every decision meant lives moved or lost. Every pause invited danger. Funk's world narrowed to what was immediately in front of him, a crossroads, a tree line, a cluster of exhausted faces waiting for direction. He did not think in speeches or slogans. He thought in seconds and meters. He thought in probabilities that could not be written down. By the time winter approached, the war had etched itself into his posture. His movements were economical, his voice steady even when his body was not. He no longer imagined the end of the war as celebration, only as cessation, an end to vigilance, an end to the constant calculation of risk. But war does not end when you wish it to. It ends when it has taken what it came for. The Ardennes would take more. Cold that punished hesitation, snow that concealed and revealed in equal measure. Funk entered that winter already worn thin, carrying months of compressed experience inside him. He did not know that all of it, every drill, every loss, every small decision made under fire, was arranging itself toward a single moment, a moment that would barely register as time, a moment when laughter would replace fear and action would replace surrender. He could not see that far ahead. None of them ever could.
The cost of this efficiency was cumulative. Funk felt it in the rare moments of quiet when his body refused to fully relax. Sleep came lightly, easily broken. His mind replayed fragments without invitation, a shout cut short, a sudden stillness where movement had been. He did not talk about this. No one did. The war normalized silence around internal damage. As summer waned and the advance pressed onward, the war began to feel endless. Each success revealed the next obstacle. Each mile gained demanded another mile's worth of effort. Funk stopped imagining endpoints. He focused instead on maintaining cohesion, on keeping his men moving as a unit, rather than dissolving into individuals reacting independently to fear. It was during this period that Funk's reputation solidified, not as a reckless fighter, but as a dependable one. Men trusted him because he did not gamble with their lives unnecessarily, and because when risk was unavoidable, he shared it. He did not ask others to go where he would not. This kind of leadership did not inspire speeches, it inspired follow-through. The hedgerows eventually gave way to more open terrain, but the lessons they taught did not fade. Funk carried them forward, integrated into a broader understanding of combat that prioritized adaptability over rigidity. Plans were useful until they were not. Survival belonged to those who recognized the moment when a plan had expired. By the time France began to feel behind them, Funk had been reshaped by constant proximity to death. Not numbed, but calibrated. He understood that courage was not a static trait, but a series of decisions renewed under pressure. He understood that fear could be managed, but never eliminated. These realizations did not make him philosophical, they made him effective. The war was not finished with him. It was still refining its demands, still narrowing the margins. Ahead lay ambition on a grand scale, an operation that promised decisiveness and delivered fracture. Funk would move into it carrying the weight of everything the hedgerows had taught him, unaware that the hardest lessons were still waiting. By the time the talk of a bold strike through the Netherlands reached the men, it arrived dressed as optimism. A clean thrust, a decisive blow, bridges taken in sequence, armor rolling through a corridor carved by airborne infantry.
The language of the plan suggested momentum, inevitability, an end in sight. For soldiers who had been measuring progress in hedgerow segments and casualty counts, the promise was intoxicating. Leonard Funk listened without comment. Experience had taught him that plans sounded strongest before first contact. Market Garden unfolded with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Airborne units dropped again, this time into daylight, into a sky that could see them clearly. Funk felt the familiar jolt of landing, the rapid orientation, the scramble to assemble coherence from scattered elements. The Dutch countryside looked deceptively peaceful, its flatness offering sightlines but no protection. Rivers and canals cut the land into natural obstacles, each bridge suddenly transformed into a strategic fulcrum. Resistance stiffened almost immediately. The enemy had not dissolved under the weight of ambition. They were present, organized, and unwilling to yield ground simply because a plan demanded it. Funk's days filled with the now familiar rhythm of advance, contact, adjustment. What changed was the scale. This was not a local push. It was a gamble that required everything to move in alignment, and alignment proved fragile. Communication faltered. Units advanced faster than supply lines could support. Information arrived late or not at all. Funk watched as confidence eroded into frustration, then into a quiet, grinding determination to survive whatever shape the failure took. Men began to understand that success was no longer about reaching distant objectives, but about holding what was immediately in front of them. The fighting around the corridors and bridges compressed time again. Days felt like weeks. Nights offered little respite, punctuated by shelling and probing attacks. Funk's role was constant triage of positions, of morale, of dwindling resources. Ammunition was counted, food rationed, sleep fragmented. The plan's elegance dissolved into the raw mechanics of defense and withdrawal. What stayed with Funk was not the operational failure, but the human cost of miscalculation. Men fought and died with the same intensity they always had, regardless of whether the plan above them held together. Valor did not compensate for structural flaws. Courage could not repair broken timelines or underestimated resistance. These realizations settled heavily, not as bitterness, but as clarity. The war was not finished with him. It was still refining its demands, still narrowing the margins. Ahead lay ambition on a grand scale, an operation that promised decisiveness and delivered fracture. Funk would move into it carrying the weight of everything the hedgerows had taught him, unaware that the hardest lessons were still waiting. By the time the talk of a bold strike through the Netherlands reached the men, it arrived dressed as optimism. A clean thrust, a decisive blow, bridges taken in sequence, armor rolling through a corridor carved by airborne infantry. The language of the plan suggested momentum, inevitability, an end in sight. For soldiers who had been measuring progress in hedgerow segments and casualty counts, the promise was intoxicating. Leonard Funk listened without comment. Experience had taught him that plans sounded strongest before first contact. Market Garden unfolded with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Airborne units dropped again, this time into daylight, into a sky that could see them clearly. Funk felt the familiar jolt of landing, the rapid orientation, the scramble to assemble coherence from scattered elements. The Dutch countryside looked deceptively peaceful, its flatness offering sightlines but no protection. Rivers and canals cut the land into natural obstacles, each bridge suddenly transformed into a strategic fulcrum. Resistance stiffened almost immediately. The enemy had not dissolved under the weight of ambition. They were present, organized, and unwilling to yield ground simply because a plan demanded it. Funk's days filled with the now familiar rhythm of advance. The cost of this efficiency was cumulative. Funk felt it in the rare moments of quiet when his body refused to fully relax. Sleep came lightly, easily broken. His mind replayed fragments without invitation, a shout cut short, a sudden stillness where movement had been. He did not talk about this. No one did. The war normalized silence around internal damage. As summer waned and the advance pressed onward, the war began to feel endless. Each success revealed the next obstacle. Each mile gained demanded another mile's worth of effort. Funk stopped imagining endpoints. He focused instead on maintaining cohesion, on keeping his men moving as a unit, rather than dissolving into individuals reacting independently to fear. It was during this period that Funk's reputation solidified, not as a reckless fighter, but as a dependable one. Men trusted him because he did not gamble with their lives unnecessarily, and because when risk was unavoidable, he shared it. He did not ask others to go where he would not. This kind of leadership did not inspire speeches, it inspired follow-through. The hedgerows eventually gave way to more open terrain, but the lessons they taught did not fade. Funk carried them forward, integrated into a broader understanding of combat that prioritized adaptability over rigidity. Plans were useful until they were not. Survival belonged to those who recognized the moment when a plan had expired. By the time France began to feel behind them, Funk had been reshaped by constant proximity to death. Not numbed, but calibrated. He understood that courage was not a static trait, but a series of decisions renewed under pressure. He understood that fear could be managed, but never eliminated. These realizations did not make him philosophical, they made him effective. The war was not finished with him. It was still refining its demands, still narrowing the margins. Ahead lay ambition on a grand scale, an operation that promised decisiveness and delivered fracture. Funk would move into it carrying the weight of everything the hedgerows had taught him, unaware that the hardest lessons were still waiting. By the time the talk of a bold strike through the Netherlands reached the men, it arrived dressed as optimism. A clean thrust, a decisive blow, bridges taken in sequence, armor rolling through a corridor carved by airborne infantry. The language of the plan suggested momentum, inevitability, an end in sight. For soldiers who had been measuring progress in hedgerow segments and casualty counts, the promise was intoxicating. Leonard Funk listened without comment. Experience had taught him that plans sounded strongest before first contact. Market Garden unfolded with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Airborne units dropped again, this time into daylight, into a sky that could see them clearly. Funk felt the familiar jolt of landing, the rapid orientation, the scramble to assemble coherence from scattered elements. The Dutch countryside looked deceptively peaceful, its flatness offering sightlines but no protection. Rivers and canals cut the land into natural obstacles, each bridge suddenly transformed into a strategic fulcrum. Resistance. The contact came not as an explosion, but as a revelation. German soldiers appeared in numbers that immediately rewrote the equation. They were not scattered remnants or nervous rear guards. They were organized, armed, and present in force. 90 of them, give or take. Enough to make resistance seem absurd. Enough to turn confidence into calculation. Orders were shouted in German, sharp and commanding. MP-40s came up with practiced speed. Funk's men were surrounded before anyone had time to consider alternatives. The geometry of the village worked against them now, buildings hemming them in, sight lines collapsing. This was not a fight that announced itself, it was an enclosure. Funk read the situation in seconds. There was no flanking maneuver here, no sudden burst of violence that could break through cleanly. His men were exposed, outnumbered, outpositioned. He made the call that leadership sometimes demands, the one that preserves lives in the moment, even if it stains pride. Weapons were lowered, hands went up, knees met frozen ground. The sound of American rifles touching snow was muted, final. The cold intensified in stillness. Funk felt it settle into his joints, into the space between thought and action. He He remained standing as long as he could, then knelt with his men. The weight of command did not lift with surrender. If anything, it grew heavier. He watched faces tighten, eyes dart. He knew what capture could mean at this stage of the war. Uncertainty layered on fear. A German officer approached him, boots crunching on snow, posture relaxed in a way that spoke of control. The man was young, confident, his uniform neat despite the conditions. He spoke quickly, his tone authoritative, his words sharp with expectation. Funk listened, head slightly tilted, trying to anchor meaning to sound. Nothing connected. The language barrier was absolute. There was a pause. The officer waited. Funk felt the eyes of both armies on him, the moment stretching thin. Something was required of him. Compliance, a response, an acknowledgement of defeat. What came instead was laughter. It escaped before it could be evaluated, a short, sharp sound that cut through the frozen air like a snapped branch. It was not mockery, it was not bravery performed. It was reflexive, involuntary, born of exhaustion and disbelief, and the absurdity of being alive in a moment that should have already ended him. For an instant, the world hesitated. The German officer stiffened. Confusion flickered across his face, followed by irritation. In that fraction of a second, Funk's perception sharpened. He saw spacing. He saw how the German soldiers clustered, how their attention narrowed toward him, toward the unexpected. He felt the Thompson against his chest, its presence suddenly vivid. He understood, without articulating it, that this was the only moment that would ever exist where action might succeed. There was no time for discussion, no room for doubt. Funk's body moved before his mind could interfere. He surged upward, ripping the Thompson free, firing from the hip as the first German fell. The sound was deafening in the confined space, the weapon's recoil familiar, grounding. Surprise multiplied the effect of violence. Men went down before they could react, shock freezing others in place. Funk advanced into the fire, not recklessly but decisively. He shouted to his men, the words cutting through fear and disbelief. A reload came instinctively, hands moving with mechanical certainty despite the cold. The Thompson resumed its work, each burst deliberate, each movement purposeful. German formations collapsed into chaos, orders drowned by gunfire and screams. 45 seconds is not long. It is barely enough time to form a coherent memory. Yet within that span, the situation inverted completely. 21 German soldiers lay dead in the snow. The number didn't feel real. Numbers rarely did. What felt real were the faces of his men, pale with cold and shock, eyes wide, searching him for confirmation that it was over. Funk gave it to them with a nod, with posture, with calm he did not fully feel. Time does not behave normally inside violence. It stretches, fractures, compresses. Leonard Funk would later struggle to explain those 45 seconds, not because they were unclear, but because they were too clear, etched with a sharpness that refused to dull. Each action existed in isolation, yet connected, like links snapping into place faster than conscious thought could follow. The first burst from the Thompson was not rage, it was correction, a violent reordering of reality. The sound tore through the village, echoing off stone and wood, louder than it should have been, louder than memory would later allow. Funk did not aim in the conventional sense. He aligned instinct with motion, firing where bodies were, where threat concentrated. Surprise did most of the work at first. Surprise and proximity. German soldiers fell before they could pivot, before training could assert itself. Those who did react found themselves reacting late, their movements half-formed, weapons coming up too slowly. Funk advanced into that hesitation, closing distance because distance favored numbers, and numbers were the one advantage he could not allow them to regain. Snow kicked up around his boots, stained dark almost immediately. The Thompson ran dry faster than it felt like it should have. Funk did not look down. He did not pause. The reload happened in the space between breaths, hands moving with a precision drilled so deeply it bypassed stress entirely. Magazine out, magazine in, bolt forward. The weapon spoke again before the echoes of the first burst had finished dying. Around him, his men were moving. Shock gave way to comprehension, then to action. Americans lunged for dropped weapons, fired from kneeling positions, from prone, from wherever they could bring force to bear. The surrender posture shattered completely, replaced by motion and noise and intent. What had been a firing squad waiting to happen became a close-quarters fight fire erupting from the ground up. Funk shouted orders, though he would later be unsure exactly what he said. It did not matter. His voice cut through panic and disbelief, anchoring his men to the moment. Leadership in that instant was not about strategy. It was about permission. Permission to act. Permission to survive. German resistance collapsed unevenly. Some fought back, firing wildly, rounds cracking past ears, slamming into walls. Others froze, trapped between training and disbelief. Others ran, breaking for alleys and doorways, fleeing not from defeat, but from incomprehension. They had misjudged the situation, and the correction was absolute. The fight ended not with a final shot, but with absence. No more incoming fire, no more movement except American. Funk slowed only when his body demanded it, lungs burning, arms trembling as adrenaline bled away. He scanned the village again, methodically, ensuring the silence was real. Only then did the weight of what had happened begin to register. 21 German soldiers lay dead in the snow. The number didn't feel real. Numbers rarely did. What felt real were the faces of his men, pale with cold and shock, eyes wide, searching him for confirmation that it was over. Funk gave it to them with a nod, with posture, with calm he did not fully feel.
There was no triumph in him, no elation, only a steady, almost clinical awareness that the margin between capture and death had been measured in seconds, and that he had spent those seconds completely. The laughter that had triggered everything now seemed alien, belonging to someone else entirely. As the patrol regrouped, Funk checked his men for wounds, for shock, for signs of collapse delayed by adrenaline. Orders resumed their normal shape. Security was established, weapons redistributed. The machinery of soldiering reasserted itself because it had to. Reflection was a luxury reserved for later. Holzheim did not echo with cheering. It absorbed what had happened and returned to stillness, indifferent. The snow kept falling, covering blood and footprints alike, already erasing evidence. The war moved on, as it always did, unconcerned with the improbability of survival. Funk felt the familiar settling of responsibility again, heavier now. What he had done would be judged later, framed in language he could not control. In that moment, it was enough to know that his men were alive. That was the only metric that mattered. The 45 seconds were over. Their consequences were just beginning. Silence after violence is not peaceful. It is disorienting. It presses inward, forcing awareness to rebound off what has just occurred. Leonard Funk felt it settle around him in Holzheim, thick and unnatural, broken only by the sound of boots shifting and breath slowly finding a steadier rhythm. The war had taught him that this phase was as dangerous as the fight itself. Shock could masquerade as calm. Collapse often waited until motion stopped. He moved among his men, checking hands for tremors, eyes for distance. Words were minimal. Reassurance came through presence more than speech. A nod, a hand on a shoulder. Orders delivered evenly, as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. Normalcy, even performed, helped anchor men back into function.
The bodies remained where they had fallen. Funk did not look at them closely. He did not need to. He had already catalogued their positions during the fight, registering threat until it ceased. Now they were weight, consequence, evidence. The snow continued its indifferent work, softening edges, blurring lines. War had a way of erasing its own handwriting almost immediately. The patrol reorganized and moved out as soon as it was feasible. Lingering invited danger. Funk understood that German forces would not ignore the disruption. Holzheim was no longer neutral ground. It was marked. They left it behind with the same professionalism they brought into it, carrying with them the invisible residue of the moment. Only later, when the immediate demands eased, did the questions begin to surface. Men replayed fragments aloud, testing their reality against each other's memory. Did that really just happen? How long was it? How did it turn so fast? Funk listened without correcting. Memory would settle in its own shape. He did not impose a narrative on it. Official channels caught up eventually. Reports were written, statements taken. The incident in Holzheim was reduced to language, to chronology, to numbers that could be reviewed and validated. Funk participated as required, answering questions with the same directness he applied to everything else. He did not embellish, he did not dramatize. He described what he did, when he did it, and why. Recognition followed slowly, awkwardly. The machinery of honor turned with a deliberate pace that felt disconnected from the urgency of the event itself. Funk was nominated, reviewed, and eventually cited for extraordinary heroism. The words sounded distant to him, as if they belonged to another man. He had not acted with an audience in mind. He had acted because the moment allowed nothing else. The Medal of Honor would later be pinned to his chest, a piece of metal heavy with symbolism and expectation. The ceremony was formal, reverent, precise. Applause filled the room. Funk stood still, posture perfect, expression controlled. Inside, he felt a familiar dissonance. The medal commemorated seconds. His life contained years shaped by war, by loss, by survival that felt less cinematic and more cumulative. He did not see himself as a hero. He saw himself as someone who had recognized a narrowing window and moved through it. The distinction mattered to him, even if it did not matter to others. Public narratives prefer singular moments. Funk understood that moments were built from layers of experience laid down over time. After the war, when the uniform came off and civilian life resumed its quieter rhythms, Holzheim did not disappear. It surfaced unexpectedly, in the pause before sleep, in the way sudden noises pulled his attention. He did not speak of it often, not out of secrecy, but out of a sense that language flattened what had been three-dimensional. People asked him how it felt. He never found an answer that satisfied them. Fear, relief, resolve, all overlapped too closely to separate. What he knew was that he had lived, and that others had not. That arithmetic never balanced cleanly. The war receded into history, but it did not loosen its hold entirely. Funk carried it with him, not as a wound that bled openly, but as a density, a gravity that influenced how he moved through the world. He worked, he lived, he aged. The medal remained, yes, but the invisible ledger of choices, of seconds that decided life or death, of fear transformed into action, followed him far more intimately after the bullets had stopped flying and the snow had melted from Belgian roads. What remains, in the end, is this, that moments of decision carry weight beyond comprehension, that courage is not a headline or a medal, but an application of will in the narrowest possible margin, that the human capacity for action, guided by instinct, discipline, and responsibility, can redefine a situation in less time than most can register. Leonard Funk's story is less about the numbers, less about recognition, and more about the immutable truth that even under impossible circumstances, choice exists, and that choice can change everything. Holzheim itself returned to obscurity. Snow covered the ground year after year. Villagers rebuilt and moved on. Maps marked its coordinates with casual indifference. But inside one man, the moment remained eternal. A collision of fear, instinct, and resolve that condensed years of training and months of war into 45 seconds. In those seconds, everything changed, and in those seconds, everything remained. The war ended. Time moved forward. Leonard Funk lived to see a world that had forgotten many details, but not entirely the lessons. What remains, ultimately, is memory. Not myth, not metal, memory. And the quiet understanding that what a human being can do when necessity compels action can ripple far beyond the bounds of time, leaving traces that endure in ways the world rarely measures.